Great Games at Your Table. I'm Jonathan Albin, Game Master's Guide. Today we are going to be talking about what is real, what is reality, and how much fantasy can we abide. This is a very sticky subject, I suppose, for some players because they are looking for the escape from the world that they live in and a place where their fantasies and their dreams can come true. We're going to be looking at all of this today and figure out how to help our players and your players have a great time experiencing your role-play environment. So before we get started, make sure you go down below and hit all the buttons and let the algorithm know that you're part of our audience, and we'll get underway.
Absorbing damage is the name of your game.
Alrighty, I just realized I didn't get the heading changed like I was supposed to, so this is going to be a little bit changed. I'll have to make an edit for that. But thank you for being here today. We are going to be talking about how to keep it real in your role-playing game. It's kind of like the age-old question. How much chocolate do you want in your peanut butter? How much peanut butter do you want in your chocolate? Back in my day, back when I was a youngster, that was a commercial for the newly developed Reese's candies, which were peanut butter cups. I know that tells you a little bit about how old I am, that was a, quote, new candy at the time. But the idea that reality and fantasy sometimes clash is pretty evident when you look at certain genres. If you are looking to consider, for example, the idea of role play, the very concept of discovering a gazebo in the old classic trope joke about role play games, the idea that the gazebo was something that was relatively new and unfamiliar to the players caused it to be a departure from reality a bit. And the idea is that the very concept of hunting down a gazebo to us seems like silly because we all know that a gazebo is a structure that stands in the backyard and provides shade. Whereas, of course, in the case of the classic trope, it's a monster that must be destroyed, and the players do everything they can to ensure its complete destruction in as short an order as possible. So the question becomes, how much of a reality do you want in your role-play game, and how much of the role-play environment should be clearly and staunchly in the fantasy? And we're going to be talking about ways to make that happen in later videos. But the whole point here is that your intention plays a very big part on how we can accomplish the idea of keeping it real. So the first thing we have to look at is your very beginning episode entry whenever you are playing a role-play game. The establishing shot, which I'm drawing from, of course, the idea of a screenplay, is you are creating a framework by which the players can transition from their unknowing position as a persona in the story into it by establishing what are the known variables, so to speak, for the game. Do they know the structures? Are they familiar with the landscape? Are they aware of distances and all of that? And by developing a strong and compelling establishing shot, setting the story directly where you want to, you are providing the players with the necessary footholds, so to speak, where they can engage in the action of the scene, knowing what they're able to push against and what their limitations are. And it's really important to make this establishing shot as clear as possible, because if you leave any variables, two things happen. Number one is the players feel ambiguity and aren't sure what they can or can't get away with, and therefore might be more concerned or trepidatious than they might be if they were better informed. And secondarily, the actions that they take won't feel as natural because they aren't going to be working with all of the resources that might have been at hand otherwise. So make sure that you establish the who, what, when, where, how, why of the establishing shot so that there is no confusion. Now, granted, there are going to be pieces of that might be secret or undisclosed, but for the most part, you want to give the players as much as possible so that they are feeling and experiencing the reality of the setting fully. Of course, the player recollections and verified notes from previous episodes really do help the players to decide what their direction is going to be. When the players actually are able to visualize and recognize where they are compared to the others in the party, for example, then they know how much support they can provide to the others in any given action and how much aid and support they might expect to get from the other players in the scene that they're involved with. This idea of verified notes is perhaps a Nycos specific, but the idea is that when you're playing a group role-play game, then the player that is in the scene, also known as the active player, is determining his course of actions given what he or she may know about the scene and is acting upon that information accordingly. But there are times when a player might request assistance from another player in terms of verified notes so that the information that they have is correct. And sometimes this feels perhaps a little disjointed, but in reality it's functioning as a cultural memory for the persona involved in the scene. Because while you as the player may not remember clearly what has happened, the character who is in the scene most certainly would have perhaps a better take on it and thereby can use other players' input to make those decisions. And this is really an important changeover from standard role-playing because this gives your players a more solid footing on what is going on in the world and how their actions will assist with and modify the outcome of the scenes. Of course, another piece of this is the idea of developing for them the various stages that might occur during a given scene, giving them a heads up that things may change over time. Furthermore, the very details of the setting, the scene, and even climate or environmental conditions really provide a more solid footing for the players to make the decisions about what they are going to do in your game session. So just realize that the elements of the adventure, which are under your control, can by their own nature be improved on by your players by giving them opportunities to interact not only in the first person with the encounter and the individuals they're encountering, but even to take advantage of the setting, the scene, and conditions they're in so that they have a better opportunity to be the change agents that you really want them to be in your game sessions. Now this, of course, leads to situational considerations, and by this I mean as your players move through the scene and engage with the villains and perhaps the non-player personas that they interact with, realize that the changing conditions and whatever may cause the situation to be considered differently. For example, if they start off the encounter out in the weather, but then transition to be in positions within the structures, then that should give them additional situational considerations as far as perhaps their footing, perhaps their visibility to the enemy locations, and the like. And by offering different and new situational conditions as you go by, you're making the session more alive and more real for them because they would be expecting those changes given the descriptions you've given. It really helps, therefore, for the players to have a handle on what's going on every bit as much as the non-player persona and the villains, for example. Now, this does lead to the broader description of location, environment, and triggers. And when you are doing, for example, a setting change, when they are moving from one place to another, the re-establishment of your establishing shot, so to speak, is really a matter of determining these locations and giving the players what the environmental changes such place will be. and how that might also be triggered. So, for example, the idea of running inside of a structure that might have better footing because of the improved weather inside also has the consideration of whether or not the monstrous beings would also take advantage of those, or if perhaps they actually would try to actually attack the location, therefore reducing the effectiveness of that locational benefit. So by giving the players information, you're also giving yourself permission for the bad guys to take advantage of that, because you've made it clear and defined not only for the players but for the villains to react to. Also, this particularly ties into the idea of triggers. There are situations that may come to be simply because there are a number of bodies. For example, you might have a wagon, and the players might gain elevational advantage by getting into the wagon, but perhaps there's a threshold on how many bodies within the wagon will cause there to be an imbalance in the wagon, and perhaps even reduce its footing beyond what was tenable on the floor, simply because there's too many bodies. So having the ability to recognize these triggers on the fly and interact with them gives you and your players the opportunity to actually get a solid hold on what this scene is in terms of their reality and how much they can affect change on the world through their actions. Now, one of my favorite things to pursue in all of this is to make sure that the players track their resource management and expenditures. And this varies from week over week, and sometimes it's a very important data point and I want to track it specifically. Generally, this is when the resources are something valuable. For example, their magical resource, if they have a limited amount of it or they don't have access to create more, they're having to utilize what they have. And by tracking this kind of management and requiring the players to have a solid understanding of how much they have left and how frugal they're going to be, it really adds to the realism of the scene. If they are literally running out of arrows, they have to consider how long they can maintain their ranged attack volleys before they have to back off and switch to more hand-to-hand weapons, for example. This can even be something as simple as firewood in a situation where they are trying to survive elemental concerns. The conditions under which they are fighting might become untenuous if they don't have the ability to track and manage what they have left in terms of these resources. And therefore it adds a dilemma factor to the game that might not have been there before. So when you are deciding what you are going to do as the storyteller for a session, realize this is one thing that you might want to take into account in terms of the player's actions and what they are going to be able to accomplish. Ultimately, it comes down to this. When your players are making their decisions about what they are wanting to accomplish, take into account what their intended outcomes are. What is it they are trying to do? If they're trying to outlast the monster, that's one strategy, but perhaps they are instead wishing to go on the assault and therefore trying to actually end the monster or drive it off. And therefore, with those changes in their intention, realize that means that the way the situation plays out would be radically different. And so realize that their direction should be accommodated in your reaction, because if they are trying to drive the monster off, their strategy and their effectiveness may change with their success or failure on the dice rolls, and therefore realize how much that's going to change the way this scene feels. We're trying to establish a way for the scene to be as real as possible and yet give the players the agency to be outlandish, outrageous, and extremely successful. This is also why you need to consider utilizing the NycosRPG method of relative successes, because it gives you much more theatrical control in terms of how the player interactions are handled, because the mechanism that allows for a partial or a wild success gives more opportunities for how you might retell the story or reinterpret it for your players during the game session, and thereby challenge or change the outcome accordingly. In all candor, it comes down to this. You need to make the story make sense. If your players in the game are feeling dissatisfied at the end of the sessions, and of course you can only know this if you debrief with them, but generally if there's a dissatisfaction, you need to figure out how to resolve that in future by making sure that the story makes sense for all involved, whether that be the good guys or the bad guys. If the success of the adventures is so overt that there's no way for the story to continue and the bad guys are eliminated, then you have to deal with that and change the course of the story because the villains are no longer capable of interacting or to pose any kind of real threat. On the other hand, if the villains are being very successful, perhaps there's some means that you can provide additional resource to the players so that they can reestablish and reaffirm their dominance in the scene and therefore drive the story the direction they want to take it in. It's really a matter of what you're trying to accomplish. All I can say is that as a game master, if you can make the story make sense, you provide the players with the benefits necessary to make the game really come alive and feel like it is real. Now, I want to thank you for being here. If you haven't yet, make sure that you like and subscribe because it really helps the channel. And if you haven't checked it out, do visit patreon.com/Nykos and figure out how you can become a part of our community by joining us there, and therefore you'll be able to be a part of our game sessions on the weekends. Until then, I want to thank you for being here. I will see you next time. And as my grandfather would say, you've done enough work for today. Now go play.